Resolution. Resolution is the most fundamental graphics setting in any game. It determines how many pixels are used to draw the image on your screen. More pixels means sharper visuals, but also more work for your GPU. You can literally see it side by side. A character rendered at low resolution looks blocky and undefined, almost like a smudge drawing. Crank it up, and suddenly that same character has crisp edges, clean features, and details you didn't know was missing. Common resolutions include 1920 by 1080, known as 1080p, 2560 by 1440 or 1440p, and 3840 by 2160, which is 4K. The jump between them is huge. 4K has 4 times as many pixels as 1080p, which means your graphics card has 4 times the work to do. That's why switching to 4K can turn a smooth 120 frames per second experience into a cinematic 27 frames per second slideshow. Then there's render scale. This controls the resolution the game actually renders internally before scaling it to your monitor. At 100%, the game renders at your screen's native resolution. Drop it to 70% and the game renders fewer pixels, then stretches the image to fill the screen. Like you're gaming through someone else's prescription glasses. Raising it above 100% renders extra detail and downscales it for a sharper image, at the cost of performance. Think of resolution as the size of the canvas, and render scale as how detailed the artist decides to paint it. I personally always check render scale first when a game runs badly. Half the time it's set to something weird by default, and bumping it fixes everything without touching other settings. Textures, texture quality, and anisotropic filtering. Textures are the images wrapped around 3D objects to give them detail. Without textures, everything would look like smooth plastic toys. A brick wall without proper textures is just a flat orange rectangle. With high-quality textures, you can see every crack, every groove, every bit of mortar between the bricks. Texture quality controls the resolution of those images. Higher settings use larger, more detailed texture files. Low settings save memory but can make objects look blurry, like someone tried to paint the world using a potato. The main thing textures affect is VRAM usage. If you've got 8 GB of VRAM, you're usually fine on high textures at 1080p and 1440p. But try to run ultra textures at 4K with only 4 GB, and you'll see stuttering, pop-in, and textures loading in chunks like a buffering YouTube video. Then there's anisotropic filtering. This improves how textures look at steep angles, roads stretching at the distance, floors across a large room. Without it, those textures get blurry fast. With it enabled, distant surfaces stay sharp. The best part? It has almost zero performance impact on modern GPUs. Honestly, anisotropic filtering is one of those settings I just crank to 16x on every game and forget about it. It costs almost nothing and the difference is too obvious to ignore. Anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing fixes one of the most annoying visual problems in games: jagged edges. Without it, diagonal lines, fences, and character models can look like tiny stair steps. It's the difference between smooth cinematic visuals and a world built with Lego stairs. FXAA, or Fast Approximate Anti-Aliasing, is the lightweight option. It smooths edges across the entire image with almost no performance cost, but everything can look a little soft. Fine details like thin wires can lose sharpness, but it's fast and effective for casual gaming. MSAA, or Multi-Sample Anti-Aliasing, is more precise. It focuses only on the edges of objects, producing much better quality, especially on high-contrast edges like railings and rooftops. The trade-off is performance. MSAA is heavy on your GPU, particularly at high resolutions. TAA, or Temporal Anti-Aliasing, uses information from previous frames to smooth edges over time. It eliminates flickering and shimmering beautifully, but can introduce ghosting or slight blur around moving objects. Faint afterimages of the last frame that some players notice during fast action. DLAA, or Deep Learning Anti-Aliasing, uses AI techniques similar to NVIDIA's DLSS, but at native resolution. No upscaling, no shortcuts. It uses NVIDIA's Tensor cores to clean up edges with machine learning. More demanding on hardware, but on RTX cards, the result is almost flawless. FXAA is fast and light. MSAA is precise but heavy. TAA is smart and smooth. DLAA is high-end perfection. The right choice depends on your GPU and your priorities. Quick question: which anti-aliasing method do you actually use? Or do you just leave it on whatever the game defaults to? Drop it in the comments. And if these settings are finally starting to make sense, hey, hit that like button. It genuinely helps the channel. Shadows. Shadows are one of the biggest factors in how realistic a game looks. Without them, objects appear to float. Lighting feels fake, and the whole scene looks like a stage play with the lights stuck on full brightness. Shadow quality controls how detailed shadows appear. On low settings, shadows look blocky or pixelated, like someone cut them out with Minecraft tools. Higher settings increase shadow map resolution, making edges softer and more natural. Shadow distance determines how far away the game renders shadows. Lower settings make distant objects stop casting shadows entirely. Higher settings stretch shadows farther into the distance, making large environments feel more believable. Then there are contact shadows, tiny detailed shadows where objects touch surfaces, under a character's feet, between rocks, where items rest on the ground. Here's a simple test. Look at your character's feet in-game. If they look like they're hovering a millimeter above the ground, contact shadows are probably off. Turn them on and suddenly your character feels planted in the world. Once you notice it, you can't unsee it. The catch is that shadows are very demanding on your GPU. I personally think shadows are the single most impactful setting after resolution. Drop everything else to medium, but keep shadows on high. Your game will still look dramatically better than the other way around. Ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion adds subtle shadows in places where light naturally struggles to reach. Corners of rooms, gaps between rocks, under tables. These tiny shadows help objects feel grounded. Without it, lighting looks oddly flat, and objects seem to hover slightly above the floor. SSAO, or Screen Space Ambient Occlusion, is the most common version. It estimates where small shadows should appear using on-screen information. Lightweight and compatible with most hardware, but it can look grainy or slightly inaccurate. HBAO Plus, developed by NVIDIA, is a significant step up. It runs about 3 times faster than the original HBAO while doubling the detail level, rendering at full resolution without flickering. In most games that offer it, HBAO Plus is the sweet spot, noticeably better than SSAO without the hardware demands of ray-traced options. RTAO, or Ray Traced Ambient Occlusion, uses ray tracing to simulate how light actually behaves. Extremely realistic, but it demands modern hardware. RTX cards or AMD's RDNA 2 and above. Expect a 10 to 15% performance hit depending on the scene. Ambient occlusion is subtle, but turn it off and the entire game world looks strangely flat and unfinished. Ray tracing. Ray tracing is one of the biggest graphical upgrades in modern games. Instead of faking lighting with clever tricks, it simulates how light actually behaves, bouncing off surfaces, passing through glass, casting realistic shadows. There are different tiers depending on what the game applies it to. Some games only use it for reflections. Look at a character's helmet with ray tracing off. Reflections are either faked or missing entirely. Turn it on and that helmet reflects the actual environment. It's the comparison that immediately sells the technology. Other games apply it to shadows or global illumination, letting light bounce between objects to naturally light entire scenes. Then there's path tracing, which simulates many bounces of light across the entire scene. Games like Cyberpunk 2077 and Alan Wake 2 offer full path tracing modes. Colored neon signs bleed onto wet pavement. Dark interiors glow with indirect light that feels physically real. But it's 30 to 50% heavier than standard ray tracing, so upscaling technologies like DLSS or FSR become almost mandatory. Upscaling. Upscaling lets your GPU render at a lower resolution and then intelligently upscale it to your monitor's native resolution, saving massive GPU power. Think of it as taking a small painting and magically stretching it to a huge canvas without losing much detail. DLSS, or Deep Learning Supersampling, is NVIDIA's AI-powered solution. It uses machine learning to reconstruct sharp, high-resolution frames from lower-resolution input. FSR, or Fidelity FX Super Resolution, is AMD's answer. Open and hardware agnostic, achieving similar results without needing AI training. Intel's XS, pronounced XS, uses AI via Intel's XMX matrix units to upscale from lower resolutions. It works better on Intel Arc GPUs, but also runs on NVIDIA and AMD hardware. Intel recently expanded XS with frame generation, making it a full performance suite competing directly with DLSS and FSR. Frame generation takes this further. Modern GPUs can create entirely new frames between existing ones, effectively doubling the frame rate. It's like your GPU becomes a stunt double, predicting where objects should be next. The trade-off is input latency. Because those frames are generated, not rendered, your inputs can feel slightly delayed. Frame generation is better suited for cinematic single-player games than competitive shooters, where every millisecond matters. VSync, G-Sync, FreeSync. VSync exists to fix screen tearing. When your GPU renders frames faster than your monitor can display them, the screen looks sliced into mismatched layers. Classic VSync locks your frame rate to your monitor's refresh rate to keep things aligned. The downside is input lag. Frames are held back, making your mouse and controller feel sluggish. G-Sync from NVIDIA and FreeSync from AMD provide a smarter solution. They let your monitor dynamically adjust its refresh rate to match your GPU's output in real time. Smooth motion, no tearing, far less input lag. NVIDIA even certifies certain FreeSync monitors as G-Sync compatible. So if you have an NVIDIA GPU and a FreeSync monitor, Adaptive Sync likely still works, which can save you hundreds of dollars versus a dedicated G-Sync monitor. These technologies also handle fluctuating frame rates gracefully. If your GPU dips from 120 frames per second to 90, the monitor adjusts smoothly instead of stuttering. I personally leave VSync off and use FreeSync on my main monitor. The difference between Adaptive Sync and old school VSync is so obvious that going back feels like putting training wheels on a motorcycle. HDR. HDR, or High Dynamic Range, expands the range between the darkest shadows and brightest highlights. Think of it as giving your monitor sunglasses and night vision goggles at the same time. Bright explosions pop without blowing up, and shadowy corners hide secrets instead of looking like muddy gray blobs. There are two parts: the display and the game. An HDR-capable monitor can physically show higher brightness, richer colors, and deeper contrasts. In-game HDR controls how the game outputs lighting to take advantage of that hardware. If one is on and the other isn't, the effect is limited. Not all HDR monitors are equal. A cheap monitor that technically supports HDR but only hits 300 nits won't deliver a real HDR experience. You want at least 600 nits for a noticeable difference, and 1000 nits or above for highlights that truly pop. I've seen people turn on HDR and say it looks worse. 9 times out of 10, their monitor just can't actually deliver it. Motion blur and depth of field. Motion blur mimics how things look when they move fast in real life. Turn it on, and car races, sword swings, and camera pans feel smoother and more cinematic. That said, motion blur is one of the most divisive settings in gaming. Some players swear it adds immersion. Others immediately turn it off. I personally keep per object motion blur on and camera motion blur off. Fast-moving objects like spinning wheels look natural, but turning the camera doesn't turn the whole screen into soup. Depth of field blurs objects on distance from the camera. It adds a sense of depth and makes scenes look less like a flat diorama. Both require extra GPU calculations, and some players turn them off entirely for competitive games. Sharp visuals and responsiveness beat cinematic effects when every millisecond counts. Post-processing. Post-processing is the layer that sits on top of all your graphics. It doesn't change models, textures, or lighting. It tweaks the final image for cinematic or stylistic flair. Think of it like Instagram filters for your game world. Bloom makes bright lights glow and bleed into surrounding areas. Sunlight off water, neon signs in a rainy city. Looks dreamy and immersive, but too high and every light source feels like a tiny sun trying to blind you. Chromatic aberration simulates camera lens imperfections, splitting colors into a subtle red and blue fringe at edges. It can add realism, but some players hate the slight blur it introduces. Film grain overlays random noise mimicking analog film stock. It can add grit and atmosphere, but overdone, it looks like you spilled pepper on your screen. Post-processing also includes lens flares, color grading, and vignette, that subtle darkening around the screen edges. Together, these effects define a game's mood. And I'll be honest, I turn off chromatic aberration and film grain in almost every game. I spent good money on a sharp display and I want to see that sharpness. If I wanted film grain, I'd watch a VHS tape. LOD, level of detail and render distance. Level of detail, or LOD, is a trick games use to save performance. Objects far from the camera get drawn with fewer polygons and simpler textures, while nearby objects get full detail. You can see this with any 3D object. Up close, a sphere looks perfectly smooth. Step back and the game quietly swaps it for a lower poly version. Step back further and it's practically a blob. You never notice because by the time detail drops, you're too far away to care. Render distance determines how far the game draws objects. Low render distance makes mountains pop in suddenly or enemies appear from nowhere. High render distances let you see far-off scenery, but they're heavy on performance, especially in open-world games. I actually love cranking render distance to max and lowering other settings to compensate. In something like Elden Ring or GTA, standing on a hill and seeing an entire world stretched out in front of you just makes the game feel massive. And that's every graphics setting, from resolution and textures to ray tracing, upscaling, and post-processing. Each one changes how your game looks and runs. Some make it beautiful, some make it smooth, and some just keep your GPU from staging a revolt. Which setting do you always change first when you start a new game? Max textures, kill motion blur, crank ray tracing, and pray? Drop it in the comments. If this finally made graphics settings make sense, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, here's the thing. You just learned what every graphics setting does. But there's one spec tied to all of this that trips up almost everyone. VRAM. 4 GB, 8 GB, 12 GB, 16 GB, 24 GB. Those numbers are plastered on every graphics card listing, but most people have no idea how much they actually need. Buy too little and your textures stutter. Your ray tracing crawls. and every setting you just learned about becomes useless. Buy too much, and you just wasted money on performance you'll never touch. That's exactly what we're covering next. Every VRAM size explained simply, what each tier actually handles, where the sweet spot is, and how much you need to stop wasting money on the wrong graphics card. Click the video on screen right now, and I'll see you there.